Good afternoon, and welcome to another very topical and very timely AMET webinar. As you know, AMET is a premier Washington think tank and policy shop here in DC. Our nation's policymakers have learned to rely upon us and to trust us to offer timely, accurate, nonpartisan education about the Middle East on Capitol Hill. Our efforts have made a difference. Looking back, that we know that we've made impactful changes to help create a more secure future for the United States and for the state of Israel. We get no government grants and rely entirely upon viewers such as yourselves to help keep us afloat. If you like what you see and hear today, and have been tuning into our weekly webinars, we strongly encourage you to please make a tax-deductible contribution to www.ametonline.org. Also, we are delighted to constantly partner with other excellent think tanks, such as the Jewish Policy Center. Please also consider making a contribution to the excellent work of the Jewish Policy Center at jewishpolicycenter.org. As of today, we have been on a roller coaster, up and down for over the last 16 months, with assurances that a deal is imminent. According to Josep Borrell of the European Union, this time it might be imminent, and the United States is weighing once again further concessions towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. Shoshana Bryen is an amazing, gifted and talented writer and speaker. She is the senior director of the Jewish Policy Center and is a leading specialist in U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs. The former executive director and senior director for security policy at JINSA, Shoshana was the author of widely republished JINSA Reports. She has also worked with the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College and the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and has lectured at the National Defense University in Washington. She's coordinated programs in the Middle East for military professionals that allowed more than 450 American military officers to engage in professional discussions of issues that both unite and divide the United States, Israel, and the state of Jordan. She's also created a program to take the cadets and midshipmen of America's service academies to Israel for a 3-week work-study program that has permitted hundreds of future officers to have a positive, in-depth experience in Israel. She's also taken Turkish and Israeli military officers to speak at the service academies and has lectured in the academies as well. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Sun, and Defense News, among other outlets. I'd just like to say that she just wrote a brilliant piece, Reviving a Dead Corpse, in Newsweek, that I found particularly compelling at this time. I would like Shoshana, first of all, to talk about the background and the context of why there's this seemingly endless, continuous loop of negotiations, 9 rounds so far in Vienna and 1 in Doha. Shoshana, give us some background here.
Okay, let's answer your question first, and then I'll give you the background on where we have been and where we are with sanctions and negotiations. There is only one of 2 reasons, maybe 2, that the Biden administration is so enamored of negotiations and wants to continue them even at this point. Either they actually believe that negotiations will work, which was the problem of American peace processors who for 35 years told you that more conversation between Israelis and Palestinians will get you to an agreed upon end. There is no agreed upon end between Americans and Iranians. It's not going to happen. So the other possibility is that they simply want out of the mess. They want to leave the Middle East. The Islamic radicalism of the region is too much for them. They just want to give it up. They want to leave it to anyone they can. And they helped the Taliban take over Kabul in Afghanistan. And maybe we're doing the same thing now. So it's got to be one of those two things because there is no other thing. And that's what leads you to reviving a dead corpse. The dead corpse was what Robert Malley, our chief Iran negotiator, said when he was pessimistic about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. And he said, it can't be done. You can't revive a dead corpse. Well, actually, you can revive a dead corpse. A dead corpse that is revived is a vampire. And they're out there, they're doing it. They're making a vampire out of us. So I want to start by explaining where we have been and tell you where we are now. This is not the first round of concessions we've made to Iran, of course. We made a whole bunch of them in 2016. One of the most important that we made then was to drop all charges. We closed the book on Iran's prior defense activity. The U.S. had been arresting and charging and convicting Iranians of illegally exporting U.S. defense-related technology and stealing that technology. With the deal, a great many Iranians were either pardoned, released from prison, including people who exported fiber optic gyroscopes, electron tubes, you know what those are used for, satellite service and high-tech industrial parts. They were released from prison. Charges against an Iranian accused of shipping antennas and aircraft parts. Charges were dropped. Fugitive warrants were dropped. So it's not just about money. It's about what the Iranians were doing to undermine American interests, Israel's security, American security, and all those other things. At the same time, they got a lot of money. John Kerry, who was then Secretary of State, he said it was $55 billion. No, it was more like $150 billion. And an extra $1.3 billion that we gave them as an interest payment on funds that we had impounded. They also got John Kerry's thanks for their gracious behavior toward 10 kidnapped American sailors that were never supposed to be taken and whose Geneva Convention rights were violated when they were photographed for propaganda purposes. So that's what they were getting. Now we got some things too. We got our 10 illegally held sailors back. We got Iranian missile tests in violation of UN resolutions. We got missiles fired near a US aircraft carrier sailing in international water. On the bright side, sometimes there's a bright side. We got, and we shouldn't minimize this because it really is important, even though none of these people should have been in Iranian prisons to begin with, we did get back a newspaper reporter, a former Marine who was visiting his grandmother in Tehran, a Christian pastor, a student in a language program at Tehran University, and a businessman. We did not get back, however, Simak Namazi, an American-Iranian businessman who was charged with espionage in 2015. Simak Namazi remains in an Iranian prison to this day, and his name has not, as far as I know, come up in this conversation. We didn't get any information on Robert Levinson, who disappeared in Iran around 2007. We also didn't get back the naval information from the boats on which the 10 American sailors were taken. So you see what they got. You see what we got. The world got an Iran that cheated on the markers going into the deal. They lied to the IAEA going into the deal. And they cheated on the deal from the moment. I was going to say the moment the deal was signed, but you know what? The deal was never signed. There is no signed Iran deal. There is no agreed upon text to the 2016 JCPOA. It is different in Farsi and in English and in French. So no signed deal. So that's where we were when Donald Trump took office. And he said, I don't want to do this. I don't want to pay them for this. I don't want to encourage them to do this. All these things that they did in violation of the first agreement, entry markers. I don't know. I don't want to do it. So he didn't. So he cut off their funds, among other things, decimated their foreign currency reserves, which meant that they had less for their nuclear program, less for Hezbollah, which is wrecking Lebanon in a way that is just heartrending. PIJ, Hamas, various militias in Iraq, By the way, pay attention to what's going on in Iraq, because the parties in Iraq want to get rid of the Iranians now. Thank you. It's been long enough. We should be helping them. When we got to that point, Joe Biden took office, and President Biden offered new inducements beginning in January 2021. In other words, right when he was inaugurated. I mean, the list was ready when he got there. The list included removing the Houthis from the formal list of U.S. State Department terror-sponsoring organizations. He ended U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Houthi war in Yemen, which the administration calls the Saudi war in Yemen. It is not. It is the Houthi war in Yemen, the Iranian-sponsored Houthi war that the Saudis were fighting. But he removed our Patriot missiles from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. He pressed South Korea to release frozen funds to Iran. The South Koreans did. Unhappily, by the way, they gave us a lot of trouble over that because they didn't want to give those funds. Ultimately, they did. The funds were used at first to pay Iran's arrears at the United Nations, which made them eligible for their rights as a General Assembly member and to now be on the on the Commission on Women's Rights, or whatever they call that disgusting thing that they've allowed all these people to sit on. That was a direct result of South Korea caving to U.S. government pressure. Sanctions were waived for those who bought Iranian oil. That's primarily China. Sanctions were waived for those who bought Iranian electricity, namely Iraq. And I can't argue too much about Iraq, but I will argue that we should not have helped China with Iranian oil. The Abraham Accords, the single best thing that happened for the people of the region, Arab people, Israeli people, Christian people, Muslim people, Jewish people, the single best thing that has happened to improve their lives. He downgraded it to the accords, the arrangements, the conversation. And the U.S. and the other great thing that was happening in the region was the East Med pipeline, which was a consortium of Cyprus, Greece, Israel, and a number of European countries to provide Mediterranean natural gas to Europe through a pipeline to Bulgaria and to Italy. This would have impacted the Russians. It would have helped the Europeans. It would have greatly increased the money to Cyprus, which is very useful. We pulled out, and I have to say that the European Union and the East Med Consortium companies are keeping it going, which is how important they think it is. But we are not there, and that is a black mark on the United States.
Right.
And the result of the Biden administration's offers, inducements, bribes to the Iranian government is that Iran's foreign currency reserves have risen from about $10 billion at the end of the Trump administration, which is nothing. In foreign currency reserve terms, it is nothing, to about 137 billion, which is actually something. And it's getting bigger every day. We also got a series of cheats in its commitments. Even the IAEA came to a point where it could no longer just ignore Iranian cheating. So in July of 2002, the IAEA found uranium traces at 3 undeclared sites. They couldn't get into those sites. They couldn't see what the uranium was. So they actually passed a resolution of profound concern. I know, it doesn't sound like a lot to us, but for the IAEA, it was a huge jump up in their level of concern. So did the Iranians cooperate? They demanded cooperation. The IAEA did. No. Instead, Iran took down 27 monitoring cameras that the IAEA had installed subject to the JCPOA. And they began putting advanced centrifuges in Natanz and at Fordow. That's the point at which Malley called this a dead corpse. Would that Malley had been right. Okay. But no, they're back at it. They are offering inducements again. I don't know what all of them are, and I don't know where we are in the conversation. I would say, however, we know what some of them are. that there is a question about when the U.S. will respond to Iran's latest proposals. There had been people saying no. It's going to be a long time. There had been people saying yes, it's coming imminently. Imminently seems to have won. So when we're finished here, I recommend that everybody go online and see where they are, because it may be that the Biden administration is providing blood to the courts. And I think maybe I should stop there.
All right. All right. I mean, the irony of all of this, first of all, we know that in June of this year, June of 2022, many courageous Iranian women were on the street throwing off their hijabs and were immediately arrested arbitrarily and thrown into this notorious Evin prison. Even their lawyers have been arrested. They do not get to see their lawyers, yet they are now in the UN Commission on Women's Rights. Something has happened, but I think part of this is that a profound failure of the imagination of the Biden administration to not develop a plan B. They have one tool in their toolbox, and that's negotiations. But there are multilateral sanctions that were in the JCPOA. We were told that there would be immediate snapback sanctions. There are sanctions from the UN. All of a sudden, the thought of sanctions has disappeared, and nobody is listening to the voices on the ground. We work very closely with NUFTI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran, and we know that we've had many speakers from NUFTI on this forum. We know that 2/3 of the country were born after the Iranian Revolution, and many of them see the theocracy as a suffocating chokehold around their necks. Why aren't we empowering these people as opposed to returning to the same old endless loop, or even worse, appeasing the Iranians with everything in their voracious appetite?
I have no better answer than I started with. Either they think it will work or they don't care. But I would add to something that you said, Sarah. We're not only appeasing them. One of the things that appears to have come out from the conversations, and I don't know if we'll accept it or we won't, so I'm going to put the caveat in here, is the possibility of removing President Trump's sanctions from ICO. ICO is an Iranian so-called nonprofit organization. It stands for the Execution of Imam Khomeini's Order. Now, there was a great article in today's, so you got to be up to date. I'm saying this to listeners, go find this. Washington Free Beacon today. Gabrielle Noronha, who is a former advisor to Iran at the State Department, gave a great assessment of this. One of the organizations funded by ICO is called the 15 Khordad Foundation. That's the one that offers bounties on the regime's enemies. Now, just last week, somebody inspired by the 15 Khordad Foundation went after Salman Rushdie. You've also had attempts on Masih Alinejad, who is an American citizen who lives in Brooklyn. They tried to kidnap her, but also Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, U.S. government officials, high-ranking U.S. government officials. And it becomes even less comprehensible that you would want to even talk to these people when they are out there. And by the way, a number of Salman Rushdie's publishers and editors in Europe have been assassinated over the last 10 years. And so the fact, I'm happy, obviously, that Rushdie wasn't killed, but remember that people around him have been killed. So your question is even more important, because it looks like not only are we doing it, but we're going to empower people like the 15 Khordad Foundation. The money's going to go to these people.
It is absolutely horrific. Another evil regime that has been our spokesperson through these negotiations, we are not, of course, allowed into the room, but it's Russia. And Russia is being empowered a great deal through this deal. Can you speak a little bit about how Russia's being empowered and how they're using certain things like drones that they get from the Iranians to execute their war in Ukraine?
Well, you just put your finger on it. When we stopped punishing people for the business that they do with Iran, certain people decided to go do business with Iran. The Chinese, yes, and the Russians. And this surprises me that Iran is a better producer of drones than Russia. That should scare you at many levels. That should be another reason that we don't want to negotiate with these people, because their ability to produce the implements of war tell you that it's not only a nuclear problem, it is an Iran problem. So yes, Iran benefits. They coordinate, and they have always coordinated oil price and sales. This makes it easier. Drones, Russia wants a place where it can be respectable. It cannot be respectable given the war in Ukraine, given Russian behavior in Ukraine, except that we allow it to be respectable in Vienna. Now, Ulyanov, the Russian ambassador to these talks and the spokesman, is himself not a nice person. He just said things about the Ukrainians. I said, the guy is not anybody we would want to have over for coffee, let alone somebody that we would trust to represent American interests fairly while Russia is under US sanction in the room with Iran. Why? I don't have an answer. I know you don't have an answer. So this may be the first time that Emmett sits here with a guest and neither one of us has an answer to the question. Right. But yet we're doing it. We're doing it. And all I can think is they don't understand themselves, or they're that desperate to get out of it.
Right. I mean, it brings to mind Winston Churchill's famous quote, "He who appeases the crocodile is only eaten last." Yes. You know, we recently had a webinar with Emanuele Ottolenghi from FDDA talking about Hezbollah and how they're recruiting just south of our border. You know, this will eventually come back to bite us in the backside. It is horrible. By
the way, not only recruiting south of our border, but U.S. agents have found people from the terrorism list inside the United States from the southern border. We are not stopping people who everything tells you, our law tells us these people can't be allowed in this country. They're a danger to us and they are here. So yes, they're recruiting for Lebanon, but they're also bringing them into the United States.
Exactly. Another thing that you briefly mentioned, but I think it is so important, is there is a new demand that from the Iranians that the IAEA just does not inspect certain sites. Can you talk a little bit about this? And has Rafael Grossi weighed in about this at all?
Yes, he has. He's more than a little bit upset. Although, look, he asked for it. Okay, I'm not a great fan of the IAEA in this circumstance. However, in the Trump administration, when it was clear that the United States was taking a very hard line on Iran and not trying to encourage them, but trying to force them, the IAEA picked up the flag a little bit, and they did more inspections, and they got a little bit tougher, and they had a little more to say. And as I said, they came out with a statement in July about the uranium that they couldn't trace. Now, so Iran says, well, we don't want to have to deal with all of this together. So let's just separate our issues with the United States and our issues with the IAEA, because we can win over the United States and we can get our deal with the United States. And at the moment, it's not clear that we can get our deal with the IAEA. So we're going to separate them, pull the Americans away from the IAEA, deal with that later, or cheat on it, or whatever you like, but separate them. This is bad for so many reasons, but beginning by saying the IAEA is the world's arbiter, not just Iran's arbiter, not just America's arbiter, the world's arbiter of nuclear safety and nuclear violations of all nuclear treaties. to separate the United States, which was a prime sponsor of the IAEA, a prime mover of the IAEA, from the organization, sets a terrible precedent for the United States and any other organization we support. Even in the Trump administration, where we pulled back funding for elements of United Nations activities that we thought were not in the interest of the West or in the interest of the United States, we did not quit the UN. We quit bodies of the UN, but it was, and there were people who said we should have quit the UN, but he probably was right that you don't want to take the United States away from that. You don't want to take the United States out of NATO. You don't want to take the United States out of the Pacific Quad. You want the United States. So the Iranians want us out. Now, are we considering, and Grossi, by the way, was very upset by that. I'll get on that. Are we going to do that? I don't know. We did separate the JCPOA in 2016 from the UN sanctions on ballistic missiles, which were UN sanctions, which, by the way, have expired. So whatever constraints there were on Iran's ballistic missile program, those are gone. We cut ourselves off from the UN. We said, well, if they want to do ballistic missile sanctions, let them do them. We're just going to do something else. So I don't know. It's a huge issue, and I don't know where it comes out. I will say one other thing. The Iranians wanted to remove the IRGC from the US terrorism list. That will not happen. It will not happen. Too many Gold Star families objected. The Iranians were responsible for killing more than 600 American uniformed people in Iraq. And I think this will not fly. Other things, yes. This one probably not.
Right. And now it is my supreme honor to turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will read some of the questions that have come in. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Shoshana, for such a timely presentation, and thank you very much for all our viewers who joined us today and who sent us questions. Please keep sending us your questions through the chat function from Zoom, and I'll get to your questions in order. We received a lot of questions, as you may imagine, Shoshana. One of the first questions that we received is, can you confirm that the Iranian position in the original JCPOA of 2015 includes no inspection of any sites, or in this negotiations, not included in the original JCPOA? Aside from the fact that there's plenty of experience that Iran does not permit adequate access to verify compliance at any of those sites, doesn't their current position also imply an admission that there are activities in other locations that they don't want anybody to see? And why would any sane agreement permit this condition?
Okay, I have not read their demands, and so I can't say definitively what the demand is regarding IAEA inspections. However, I would say that the Iranians certainly would not have fewer demands about those inspections. They would, in their attempt to separate the US from the IAEA, they would want to say, and the IAEA is irrelevant and therefore it should not be allowed to inspect these things. So you could see how that could be in there. I can't attest to it, but it makes sense from what we do know about the Iranian position.
We've received a number of questions mentioning the name of former President Barack Obama, so I'm going to try to combine them all together. Why are the Obama folks and now the Biden folks are so motivated to engage in such deals, even despite of a lot of the common sense criticism that you've expressed here today? And would it be paranoid to consider whether the Obama administration and its continuation today to be suffering from anti-Israel prejudice?
Okay, the anti-Israel thing, neither administration wants Israel to be what would be called the strong horse in the region. They are not interested in that. Does it stem from anti-Israel bias? I doubt it. I think it stems, that's a nice byproduct. I mean, they're not going to object to that bias coming out. But I think the real motivation here is that these people have convinced themselves that negotiations work. And in the case of Israel and the Palestinians, you know it doesn't work. If two sides do not have an agreed upon end game, there won't be successful negotiations. Successful negotiations happen only when the end game is agreed in advance, and the question is how you get there. The end of World War II, FDR had told Dwight Eisenhower, give me the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. The Germans did not agree to that. So we bombed them until they did. When they got to the conversation where they surrendered to the United States military, they had agreed that surrender was going to happen. So until you get to an agreed upon end game, the Palestinians and the Israelis do not agree on the end game. The Iranians and the Americans don't agree. So I don't believe that negotiation will make them agree. And 35 years of Israel-Palestine conversation proves me right. But they are wedded to it. They want to do it. If you listen to those people, Mali is wrong. You can try to revive a dead corpse. Go ahead.
Is there anything positive that can be said about the JCPOA or this New Deal for this matter in terms of postponing Iranian nuclear breakout?
Look, Iranian nuclear breakout was always going to come when the Iranians wanted it to come. The Iranians have both nuclear and non-nuclear ambitions. Having this conversation focusing on the nuclear weapons has allowed Iran all this time to focus on its conventional issues. It wants to control Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. They are encircling Israel, and by the way, encircling Saudi Arabia on the ground militarily. Iran's goals include, for example, Mecca and Medina. They're not going to get that with a nuclear weapon. But if you can destroy Saudi Arabia, or you can put your bases on the heel of the boot of Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and you can control the countries that all bridge Saudi Arabia on the top, you have a better chance of someday making it to Mecca and Medina. That's not a nuclear issue. It's a big Iranian issue. So I don't think that the 2016 deal prevented nuclearization of Iran. Certainly it didn't. But do I think the Iranians were rushing to a deal? No, they weren't rushing to nuclearization. By the way, I'm not sure they're rushing to it now. It's a great diversion from the other things that they do that are very important to them. And at the end of the day, they expect to have a nuke anyway. So no, I don't think it helped. I think it just covered up a lot of other egregious Iranian behavior on the ground.
Do we know if the United States is relying on Israel to take out Iranian capabilities, missile delivery capability, their nuclear capabilities, if needed?
It would be a really bizarre thing if the United States undermined Israel at every turn, which this and the Obama administration have done, and then expected Israel to save our neck. I almost said another part of our anatomy, but I won't do that. To save our neck if we are wrong and the Iranians do bad things. But yeah, I do think there's a certain understanding that Israel sees the world differently than we do, and that Israel will not permit certain things to happen. And by the way, let me just say here, it doesn't require that Israel take a large bomb and destroy the Fordo nuclear plant or the Natanz nuclear plant. There are many ways to keep the Iranians from using those spaces without blowing up large cities with large numbers of Iranian civilians in them. And those are under consideration as well. If you want really good information, there's a great website called optimist.com. Jennifer Dyer is a retired United States naval commander, and she writes about these things. She's also written in our magazine In Focus. And Jennifer says, if you are looking for preemption from Israel, it's probably not going to come that way because it doesn't have to. It will come other ways and it will be useful. So I think it's just something to consider. The Israelis do not want to drop large bombs on civilians.
Thank you. In retrospect, what was the justification, if negotiations were ever desirable with Iran, for agreeing to the humiliation of no direct negotiations, you know, sitting across the hallway in another room and not directly talk to the Iranians?
No justification. No way. No way. If the United States presumes to have a conversation with somebody It should have a conversation with somebody. We said first that the EU could represent our interests. I'm not sure I agree with that either, because the Germans have great interest in ending the economic sanctions. The Germans really want to get into the Iranian market, especially if the sanctions on oil sales are lifted. So I don't think it was ever a good idea. However, worse than that, at one point, the Chinese were our interlocutors. While we were fighting, and I'll call it this, the Wuhan virus, the virus that was created in a Chinese lab, was decimating people around the world. They were our interlocutor in Vienna. Then it became the Russians, Ulyanov, and we know about the Russians in Ukraine. So now there's no justification. This is not a negotiation. If we're not in it, it shouldn't happen.
We received multiple questions about the U.S. Congress. INARA and the U.S. Congress. What is the role of the Congress in approving or disapproving this deal?
Okay. The Obama administration tried to say that the JCPOA was not a treaty. Although it has all the functions of a treaty, it does commit the United States government to do things on behalf of the American people. So it is a treaty. He wiggled around it. I call it worm wiggling, because he knew he couldn't get it ratified. Treaties have to be ratified in the Senate. 2/3 vote, have to ratify a treaty. He didn't want to send it. He didn't send it. And the Democrats in the Senate allowed him to wiggle on it, including people who claim to be pro-Israel. They allowed him to do this backwards kind of thing. Bob Menendez may have been the only honorable Democrat at the time. So Congress passed a law. Sarah, remind me the name of that thing.
NARA, the Iranian Nuclear Agreement Review Act in 2015.
Okay. Which says that any deal has to come to the Congress. I think, first of all, that we need to worry about how to implement that. But I also think that the end game should be to get this to the Senate, where it needs 67 votes, because you need the names of those who are for and those who are against. And it may be one of the reasons that the administration delayed for a while, because some of these people are up for re-election. And if you had to put your name on the New Deal, I think it could get you diselected in November. So maybe that's one of the reasons they waited. But I think it's imperative that the Constitution of the United States be followed here. We have a Constitution. It has a requirement. The requirement is the treaty gets voted on. And if you're willing to subvert the Constitution for that, then you're willing to subvert the Constitution for anything. And this one comes at the top of the pile because it involves foreign countries and how other countries see the United States and see our rule of law and our Constitution. And if we don't submit this, Obama did it. He subverted the Constitution big time, but he had willing partners on the Hill. Does Biden have willing partners? I don't know, but let's find out.
Thank you. And staying on this thread, there is another question asking, would it be legal for the Biden administration to agree to provisions which would penalize the United States if a future president withdraws from the deal?
Well, I don't know. See, that's a really good question. If it isn't a treaty, if it's just a document, if it's not even a handshake, it's not signed, it's not anything, then there is nothing that keeps the future president from withdrawing. And so that's where President Trump was well within his rights to withdraw. So you have two issues here. Number one, if you demand that it be a treaty, a future president would be bound, but that's why I think it won't pass the Senate. And so you can get rid of the whole thing. If they do it as a subversion again, and just say, well, we're going to live by these provisions, then nothing prevents the next president from pulling out. So which way do you want to be bound? Do you want to get rid of the whole thing, which is fine with me. So you put it up as a treaty, it will lose, I believe. And then it's done. I cannot see a circumstance in which 67 United States senators vote for this.
Thank you. We received a comment and a question that I very much sympathize with. It starts with, I am baffled.
Okay.
If so many countries are threatened by Iran, so many countries are against Iran, the Iranian regime and nuclear Iran, why is it so difficult to team up and execute a regime of harsh sanctions and to bankrupt Iran. Even the Iranian people are sick and tired of their own regime. Why are we so afraid to do this, and why?
Why is President Biden and his advisory team afraid to do this? The rest of us, because I'm baffled too, I think most Americans would say, if you could stop the Iranian regime, you should do that. I think it's only the Biden administration's little cadre of people around him and that were around President Obama. And, they're the same people. They are the ones who want this to work out in some happily ever after fashion. Now, why is it so hard to get other countries to go with us? It wasn't that hard. Excuse me. It wasn't that hard in the Trump administration. That's part of where the Abraham Accords came from. Countries in the region who were concerned about Iran's role in the region. And so there were certain countries who actually signed on to the Abraham Accords. There were certain countries who didn't sign on but cheered it on, and that would include Saudi Arabia. Countries like Jordan and Egypt, which had peace treaties with Israel before, actually became better partners in peace because of it, because they saw the combination of the United States and Israel as the regional strong horse. So they came together and they worked on this together. The problem now is if the United States is pulling out, and if the United States is going to undermine Israel, and if the United States empowers Iran, then those people have bet on the wrong horse, which is why you have the UAE reopening its embassy in Tehran right now. This weekend, it's done. So it's a problem. The UAE, which is Israel's best, I have to say, best Abraham Accords partner, socially, politically, economically, they are afraid that it's a bad bet. And so they've gone to Iran to hedge the bet. That's where we are.
Right.
It's not to say that we couldn't get.
Right.
We did get.
I just would like to interject here. First of all, those countries that are most immediately threatened existentially by this Iranian agreement don't even have a seat at the table. And as Prime Minister Netanyahu once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you are on the table. And no one knows better than Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour from his recent trip to Abu Dhabi, what the people in the region think that are most immediately threatened, not only the Israelis, but the Emiratis and the Saudis. He calls it diversification of the portfolio, because they all realize that America is no longer the strong horse. And as Osama bin Laden said, if I see a strong horse and a weak horse, I bet on the strong horse. So here we are. It's horrible. I'm sorry, Hussein, go ahead.
Oh, it's horrible, but it's necessary to say it, Sarah.
Is the United States, we received multiple questions asking about the other aspects of the United States' efforts to confront Iran. Is the United States doing anything at all to undermine the Ayatollah's regime, besides sanction? Is the United States, does the United States have any strategy to destabilize this theocratic regime?
Not only do we not, we don't want one. I mean, President Obama had said, and President Biden has said, and President Trump alluded to, the goal here was not to do regime change. Our experiences with regime change in the Middle East have been uniformly dreadful, uniformly dreadful. One of the reasons that the Abraham Accords emerged without the United States, actually, I mean, there was U.S. assistance behind the curtain, but one of the things that encouraged them to look at Israel was that the Arab Spring brought you the civil war in Syria, which killed more than 500,000 people, brought you Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it brought you upheaval in Libya that's killed thousands, tens of thousands of people. So asking us to do more regime change is probably a mistake. However, there are things that one can do. And if you look at our Cold War experiences, we did not announce that we were subverting the Soviet government, but we were broadcasting all the time in Russian, in English. We had two separate sets of broadcasts. One was to tell the Russian people what was going on inside their own country, because they often don't know. And the other was to tell them what was going on in the rest of the world, because certainly they didn't know. Now, there's a lot more free media today than there was, even for people in restricted societies. But I will never forget when Natan Sharansky came out of the Gulag and he went to Israel. One of the things he said was, we knew you were there. We knew you were behind us. We knew you were broadcasting. We knew you were talking. US government officials would go to the Soviet Union. And I remember George Shultz in the Reagan years went to a Seder at a dissident house. And he said, this is what we do. He held a cup of wine. He said, this is what we do. This is who we support. And none of that happens. There is still broadcasting into Iran, but it's not very effective. And no, the idea of planning for the undermining of the government, not. Which is probably a mistake, because like Nazi Germany, I mean, if you don't get rid of the center, I'm not sure how the rest of Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or, you know, any of these countries ends up an independent country with a serious foreign policy.
Thank you. Speaking of Lebanon, we received one question about actually the French role in Lebanon. Isn't it enabling the Iranians through their close relationship with, indirect close relationship with Hezbollah via the Total oil company?
Yes, there is some French guilt to be born here, but let me say to you also, there is US guilt to be born here. We have a negotiator that's trying to solve the maritime border problem between Israel and Lebanon. His name is Amos Hochstein. He is a Biden advisor. And Amos Hochstein wants Lebanon to be able to access the natural gas off its coast and sell it and use it. Now, who's running Lebanon? Who needs this natural gas? Well, Hezbollah. So in the interim, by the way, Hochstein says, look, there's another way to do this. We can get natural gas to the people of Lebanon. We'll take Egyptian natural gas. We'll send it through Israeli pipelines to Jordan, Jordan pipelines to Syria, Syria pipelines to Lebanon. And then Hezbollah can have its natural gas. Thank you, Israel. Wait, Syria is going to get to transit this gas? Are we going to pay them to transit gas? Hochstein says no, but he says they'll be entitled to a cut of it for doing that. So not only are we empowering Hezbollah in Lebanon, we're empowering Assad in Syria. So yes, you can blame Total, but please do not blame Total before you blame us as well. Same boat.
Thank you. How can the administration sell to the American people a deal that's far worse than the JCPOA, as everybody agrees, during the same time that it became widely known that the IRGC is actively plotting the assassination of former U.S. government officials?
I don't think it can sell that to the American people. One of the things that surprises me, you know, you have people on the Hill like Ted Cruz who are hugely opposed to this deal, who are wonderfully, outspokenly opposed to this deal. But there aren't that many others. I mean, there needs to be a concerted effort to link what happened to Salman Rushdie and to link the cases of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Masih Alinejad to the IRGC. And we're not doing it. Somehow it's not getting out there. It needs to get out there.
We received a few comments seeking to clarify the website of the Navy intelligence analyst, J.A. Dyer.
Okay, her name is Jennifer Dyer, and it's optimist.com. If it isn't, if I'm making a mistake here, because I don't have it in front of me, if I'm making a mistake, Google Jennifer Dyer, U.S. Navy, retired, and you will find her.
Thank you. Somebody said it's the optimistic conservative. That WordPress.
You know what? Optimist.com is on what she puts on Twitter. The optimistic conservative. Yes, the optimistic conservative. Go there, read Jennifer Dyer. Great. Thank you. And thank you to the questioner.
Thank you. What will happen if the corpse is really dead and you can't actually restore the deal and the negotiations finally collapse without a deal? What kind of decisions or policy options will be in front of the Biden administration at this moment? And will they be able or willing to take tough decisions, to make the tough decisions?
The first, I don't think the Biden administration will admit it's dead. I'm surprised Malley did. But you notice Malley was wrong. It's not dead. So the first would be, one would assume, a restoration of sanctions. You would assume that. Secondly, you would go back to what I know we have been doing or have been doing in the past, and that is conversations between Israel's military and intelligence services and those of the United States and the Gulf countries. U.S. and Israeli intelligence cooperation with Gulf states far predates the Abraham Accord formalization. Okay, there's been a lot of conversation all the way through this. They're going to have to go back to that in a big way to decide what is militarily feasible, because clearly a lot of this stuff is not politically feasible. And here I would hope that they would ask Commander Dyer, U.S. Navy retired, to come in as a consultant. But those military options have to be somewhere in the conversation. I do not believe they are at the moment, although the military people do seem to have a better understanding of this than the American political officials.
Given the advanced stage of the Iranian nuclear program, for example, the IAEA believes today that Iran has accumulated over 40 kilos of enriched uranium. And the Iranians themselves said that they can start working on a bomb if they so choose. And given that we have a terrible record in the past in confronting Iranians on their enrichment activities, for example, when they enriched it to 60% and we said and did nothing, and they in the future this may indicate that they can enrich to 90%. Shouldn't we start now to refocus on the containment of a nuclear Iran, or is it too early?
Absolutely, we should. And the first thing we should do is make it clear that the IAEA is our partner in this, and that no way are we going to undermine their work, number one. And number two, we're going to insist that they take stronger action. So that's just got to be done to get that off the table as a possibility. So that's number one. Secondly, the question would be about containment. And again, there are lots of things that one can do to contain the Iranians. And the Israelis have been, there's an awful lot of sabotage that goes on inside of Iran. And I suspect there will be more. There are overt ways to do this as well. And one of the reasons that you don't want to put a new agreement out there is that if you take an overt action against it, somebody will say, well, you violated the treaty. If there's no treaty and they're violating old precepts that we know were there, it's a little harder to complain. And it's a little harder for the United States to complain. So in some ways, if you're going to go with overt activity, as opposed to covert, and a lot of the things that Israel may still do will be covert. And by the way, has support on the ground in Iran from Iranians who don't like their regime. So this is not just Israel. There is an element of the Iranian people who were active participants in this. And bravo and God bless those people, because it's very complicated. But yeah, they're going to have to start moving on containment. And by the way, let me simply point out, as my husband, the eternal pessimist, pointed out this morning, they may already have a bomb in the closet. It is not inconceivable that among the things they did with North Korea and with Pakistan was acquire an actual bomb. So just keep in mind that a lot of this conversation, although it talks about allowing the Iranians to create something they haven't previously created, they may have them.
We received a number of questions asking if the Biden administration is headed to a very flawed and dangerous deal. Is there anything that we can do to stop it from completing this course?
No. If the administration decides that the deal is good enough for it, it will take it. Now, what comes next should be a revolution in the Senate demanding that it become a treaty and that they get to talk about it. And each of those senators should put his or her name on it. I mean, we need to turn this into an American constitutional issue. Foreign policy is largely left to the president. That's the way the Constitution decided it. But they deliberately wrote the checks and balances. This is one of those. And if Congress doesn't demand its rights, then I think it's hopeless. I don't know what you do. If the Congress can't stand up and say, we passed a law here, and we have a constitution here, and a constitution, if we can't have our own internal house in order, why would anybody deal with us anyway? But can you stop the Biden administration? Can you stop Robert Malley from shaking hands as he did with those disgusting people? No, you can't. He's there and we're not.
Thank you. What if, contrary to all signs so far, a highly flawed deal is reached and we wake up tomorrow, to the news, and headlines, that's it, they agreed to the new deal. We try to do things here, use Congress members object to this, but the administration go with it. Anyways, what then will Israel do? What are the options in front of Israel?
Oh, I don't know what Israel would do because I'm not an Israeli and never claimed to speak for what the Israelis will do. What the Israelis have done, and they've been pretty clear about having done, is made their own plans separate from our plans. Do I know what they are? No, nobody called me to tell me. But do I believe that they have partners for their plans? Yes, I do believe that. The real question will be for the United States. If they come out and say there's a deal and nobody, the people, we can exercise our right to protest because that's in the Constitution. But if the Congress of the United States doesn't act to keep a president from signing away American capabilities, then no. Then you just wait for the Israelis to say this morning is the unacceptable morning and we have to do something.
I would also like to add that Hussein and I have had either Zoom meetings, and lately the Hill is opening up personal meetings on the Hill with both sides of the aisle. And even liberal Democratic offices are aware of ANARA. They say that they are, so grateful for keeping us up to date, but they want to insist that this deal gets reviewed. We would love to bring it up to the Senate as a treaty. I mean, that is the ultimate deal breaker, but we'll see. We'll see.
If they are prepared to insist upon seeing the entire deal, secret clauses and everything, they've got to see the whole deal.
Right.
I believe they will then insist upon voting on it.
Mm.
So I guess the first step is to have them insist upon seeing every scrap of paper, including the one Malley's going to hide in his underwear when he leaves.
Right. We also believe that maybe every single great organization that we partner with, including the Jewish Policy Center, should take out full-page ads, insisting that we follow the Constitution of the United States and this is a treaty.
Love it. Let's do it.
Let's do it all together. And I'm sure FDD would join in. I'm sure other great organizations. I'm sure NUFTI would join in. Other amazing organizations that we partner with constantly would love to do something like this.
That would be a great idea. And
Yeah.
the only optimistic thing that comes out of this entire hour of conversation, I think, people who listen to our webinar, we have Jason Greenblatt tomorrow, which would be a lot of fun.
It's wonderful.
I
Yeah.
always try to end the conversation on a positive note. And I was sitting here thinking, between the two of you, Hussein and Sarah, where was I going to get a positive thought as an ending thought? But maybe that's it. Maybe that we come together and we do something useful from outside the government to try to, it's the government to do what it should do.
Exactly. We can, any more questions, Hussein? Any further?
We do have a lot of questions, but we're out of time. So I want to
We're out of
apologize to
time.
all our
Okay.
viewers who were not able to get to the
Hussein,
questions.
if you want to send those to me, I'm happy to address people's questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Shoshana, for your usual and customary brilliance, insight, and wisdom. You know that we at Met adore you. I personally adore you and love to have you on. This was a great webinar. So I encourage everybody not only to help ametonline.org, but also to help the jewishpolicycenter.org, so we can all continue to thrive and dialogue and have useful ideas going forward in the future.
One last question to Shoshana. Actually, people are asking if we want to watch your webinars or follow your webinars on the Jewish Policy Centers. Where should we go? How can we access them?
jewishpolicycenter.org. The webinar sign up is on the front page and we'd love to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoshana. It's always a pleasure.
It
And
was my
thank you to our audience who's joined us today, as usual. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.